Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Miriam Aliso, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Unraveling the Mysteries of Pre-Employment Transition Services under WIOA. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. You will notice on your screen a screenshot of an example of the GoToWebinar interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop in the upper right corner. You are listening in using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the phone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. Be sure to put your unique PIN. To the right of the GoToWebinar PowerPoint viewer is the GoToWebinar control panel. This is where you have the option to select the way you hear the webinar, raise your hand, ask questions by text. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your question into the Questions for Staff pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect this and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. You can also download the webinar handout, which is the slides in PDF format. And now I'll introduce our director, Dr. Josie Badger.
Okay, Miriam, thank you so much. And welcome everyone on webinar today. And thank you so much to Ron Hager from NDRN for presenting today. We are having a presentation on unraveling the mysteries of pre-employment transition services under WIOA. And this has been an ongoing topic of interest for our parent centers, families, and youth as more details from WIOA have been coming out, as different pre-employment transition services have been being offered across the country. And so we are always happy to have Ron join us and give us his insight on the new steps in our work. So thank you, Ron, for joining us, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Josie, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. As Josie mentioned, as the plans have been unrolling across the country, we thought it would be a good idea to take a step back and see exactly what should be happening, so that you can look at what's happening compared to what should be happening, and also provide information for parents and students in your states to give them the best information possible. So that's what our goal for today is. And as Miriam said, we will do questions at the end. So could we turn to the next slide, please? So this is from Senator Tom Harkin. And this bill, WIOA, was one of his legacies. He really wanted to try and do something before he retired. And so his words from this quote, "The days of students with disabilities leaving school poorly educated, with no employment experience and no job prospects, living in poverty, and too often ending up in segregated day programs and sub-minimum wages needs to come to an end." Ironically, he made this statement with passage of WIOA in 2014, but when IDEA was first passed, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, in 1975, that was one of the whole purposes of IDEA, was to better prepare students so that when they left school, they would not end up without a job. They would have the skills that they needed to have a job. So it's kind of sad that even after all these years, we're still focusing on the same issues, but we just have to keep moving forward. We have a lot more tools to make this happen. So please go to the next slide. So under WIOA, some of the key purposes of WIOA Nope. There you go. Was to increase, nope. A little jumpy. One more forward. There we go. To increase the focus, nope, too far. There we go. To increase the focus of serving our most vulnerable workers, including low-income adults and youth with limited skills. So it wasn't just youth that they focused on. They wanted to continue to increase the job skills for people with disabilities, to improve access to in-demand occupations. You also see there was more of a focus on employer engagement. It also requires the VR system to work better with the workforce development system, as well as other partners across the state, which we'll go into a little bit later. Next slide. So anyway, IDEA added transition services in 1990. And the VR Act, the Rehab Act, was amended in 1992, and they added transition to the Rehab Act. So you have special education, having transition added under special education in 1990, transition services for under VR in 1992, then again in 1998, and the 2001 regulations implementing the 1998 amendments. This is where the next several slides quotes come from, and the key language did not change. So all these things started explicitly being required in 2001, are still required today, although you could argue that they should have been going on all the way back to 1992. So the first point, VR agencies are to be actively involved in transition planning with school districts, including outreach to and identification of students with disabilities. This is the VR agency's obligation. This is from 2001. Outreach to and identification of students with disabilities who may need transition services as early as possible during the transition process. Consultation and technical assistance to the school people, and involvement in transition planning with the school people that facilitates development of the IEP, all the way going back to 2001. Now what happened was, when the regs came out, the administration said, this is new stuff that is being added to the VR agency's plate. And I don't know about you, but when you have a job, you're already full-time working, and then they tell you to do more, you know, what do? You kind of have a hard time trying to fit it in. So as we look at the history of the implementation of the VR role in transition, I think that has something to do with why it was so hard for the VR agencies to fulfill the expectations of the Rehab Act. And you'll see some more of these slides, what they were supposed to be doing, and you can answer the question for yourselves whether you were seeing that happening in your state. Next slide, please. So VR is supposed to be providing active participation throughout the transition planning process, not just when the student is nearing graduation. Then they also are supposed to be, or could be, providing services, not just consultation, but actual VR transition services, because that was added as a VR service back in '92. When they did provide actual VR services, the client would have to go through the application eligibility determination process, have an IPE, and then potentially get transition services. Next slide. So VR is supposed to be informing students of the purpose of the program, the process for eligibility, as early as possible during the transition planning process. And the reason is to enable students with disabilities to make an informed choice on whether to apply for VR services while still in school. It's up to the school, the student, and the family to decide when to apply for VR services. So unlike what the regs say, so often we see the VR agencies historically telling families, telling students, you have to wait till your senior year, your last year of eligibility, whatever. That was complete bonkers. And it had been since, these are explicitly spelled out in 2001. So what was going on was, 1992, Congress tells the VR system, we want you to be involved in transition, both in terms of helping the school people develop the transition plans for the students, as well as potentially providing services. 1998, they say, we really mean it. And they come out with these very explicit guidelines in 2001. So 2014, they say, we really, really, really mean it. Because as we know, this just was not happening. So if you go now to the next slide, in 2014, one of the biggest changes in WIOA was that the Rehab Act, Congress is mandating that every VR agency spend at least 15% of their total VR budget on pre-employment transition services. And we're going to more about what that is in a minute. And those are to be provided to students with disabilities, whether or not they've applied for VR services, whether or not they've been eligible. Now, there's a separate category of youth with disabilities that are not eligible for pre-employment transition services, but that group of people can still get transition services, as they always could. So we have the transition services for youth with disabilities, pre-employment transition services for students with disabilities. Next slide. So who is a student with disability who is eligible for pre-employment transition services? You have to be enrolled in school, although it's very broadly defined: post-secondary school, homeschoolers, non-traditional post-secondary schools, secondary schools, anything, as long as you're between the ages of 16 and 21 and you're enrolled in some school program, unless the state has a different age range. So some states have 14, New York has 15, Michigan goes to 26. So whatever your state transition age is, that's the age in which the VR agency would be required to provide pre-employment transition services. So you have to be a student with a disability, basically between 16 and 21, and either be identified under IDEA as a student with a disability or be identified as eligible under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And the reason why they chose this broader definition was to ensure that the broadest potential group of students would be eligible for the pre-employment transition services. Okay, go on to the next slide. So what did WIOA require? So we have two different categories of activities. One is required activities, and the second is optional categories if they haven't spent their entire 15%. So the first one is job exploration counseling. What do you want to do when you grow up? I don't know what I want to do when I grow up, and I'm almost ready to retire. The other thing is, well, I really know what I want to do when I grow up, but will I be able to do it? Or what could I do given the nature of my disability? That's another critical piece of job exploration counseling, which should be part of pre-employment transition services. So there's counseling, work-based learning experiences in integrated settings in and out of school. This is actual hands-on, on-the-job training in real work settings, in integrated settings. And then counseling on post-secondary opportunities and options. It could be a program of traditional higher education. It could be a career and technical education. For students with intellectual disabilities, it could be the TIPSID programs, the programs for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So these are all part of the required options. Next. Also, workplace readiness training, whether it's independent living skills, social interaction skills. Now, these are supposed to be individualized, so not every student that's eligible for pre-employment transition services would necessarily get every single service. It should be based on what the individual needs of the student are. And then self-advocacy skills, which we know is a critical piece for students with disabilities as they transition from school to adulthood, where they're the people that are going to be primarily responsible for advocating for themselves. It could include person-centered planning, peer mentoring, and working with people, mentoring with people that are already competitively employed. Next slide. So in addition to the required activities to students directly, these are also required. And it's the coordination activities, attending IEP meetings when invited. If the school is not inviting the VR agency to the table for transition age youth, that's an IDEA violation and something that should be addressed within your state, either through your own work that you're doing, in conjunction with the Protection Advocacy Agency in your state. But that's something that you need to address. If they're not even inviting, the schools are not even inviting VR to the table, that's a special ed system issue. If the VR agency is not coming, that's a VR issue. Your client assistance program, you could work with them. In most states, the client assistance program is with the P&A agency, and others it's separate. But this is something at the systemic level that we want to make sure is happening, that they're being invited and they're participating, whether they're in person or by phone. We want the people at the table. Since 1992, Congress has recognized the critical importance of having that rehab counselor hat and experience at the table when planning for transition. Working with local workforce development boards, one-stop centers, employers, developing work opportunities for students with disabilities. So this is kind of more workforce development, employment, employee development. Working with schools and carrying out their obligations under IDEA to coordinate and ensure provision of pre-employment transition services. We'll see in a minute, there's going to need to be a comprehensive plan between the school system and the VR system, so that not all of these services have to be directly provided with VR funding. It could also be provided by special ed funding. It's up to the state to determine the mix of how they determine how things are going to be done in their state. But we want to just make sure that the things that are supposed to be happening are happening. And also, when invited, attending person-centered planning meetings for students receiving Social Security benefits. Next. So those are the required services. And then the next several slides talk about quote unquote authorized activities, which are very important. There's no reason they cannot do them with other funding. They don't have to just use pre-employment transition service funding to do it. But these are, as you'll see, things that are helpful for this system, for the VR system to be engaged in. The other thing I wanted to say is, we heard at the RAISE Summit that in some states, the VR agency is contracting with an agency to do their quote-unquote pre-employment transition services. Then they have no money to do the things that we talked about in terms of going to IEP meetings and other things. The whole point of the money being dedicated for pre-employment transition was to also make sure the VR staff could get to these meetings. So in terms of how your state is implementing pre-employment transition services, they shouldn't be eating their entire budget up with contracts with subcontractors. They can, but if they do, the VR agency is still supposed to be at the table with the special ed system and coordinating services. So this is a critical piece to look at how, in fact, your state's implementing the pre-employment services. The other thing is, if they have, well, this is our thing, and this is it. If you don't like it, too bad. You have to make sure that whatever it is they are doing covers all of their required activities, whether it's through the school system, the VR system, or a combination of both. We, quoting Tom Harkin, the time for having students leaving school not having the skills they need to be successfully employed in competitive integrated employment are over. The whole purpose of all of this stuff is that ultimate outcome, that when students are exiting school, either they have the skills they already need or they have the tools to go on for further training to then get the competitive integrated employment. So these other activities that are the authorized activities include such things as implementing strategies for increasing the likelihood of independent living, especially for students with the more significant disabilities, to make them be able to live independently. Go on to the next slide, please. Instructing VR counselors and school transition personnel and other people involved in supporting students with disabilities, on-the-job training, if you will, to help, theoretically, VR counselors and school transition people are supposed to know all this stuff. We know they don't. So certainly it'd be not a bad idea to have in-service training for those that are involved in this process. Disseminating information about effective strategies and approaches. Next slide. It's kind of interesting because coordinating services with transition providers under special ed and IDEA, that's kind of a mandated service. Applying evidence-based findings to improve practices, developing model demonstration projects, these are all the authorized services. So in addition to the services to the individual students, coordinating activities at school, and these authorized activities. There's also a collaboration requirement. Next slide, please. Now, this is coming from all the different parts of WIOA in terms of who the rehab counselors, the VR system is supposed to be engaged in to ensure kind of a one holistic approach. Education agencies, providers of job training, the Medicaid and DD system in your state, Centers for Independent Living, housing, transportation. Also, they talk about assistive technology, the State Assistive Technology Act provider, that the VR system needs to be engaged in all these systems within their state. But we're going to just be focusing for the next minute or so on the specific requirements for the VR system and the special education system. So next slide, please. So there's a specific interagency agreement between the special education system at the state level and the state VR system to ensure coordination involving the provision of these pre-employment transition services. Who is responsible for doing what? How is the VR counselor going to get at the table, whether it's individually or through conference calls? And it's got to be, it's critical that this plan is explicit about who is responsible for doing what. And in the language of the Rehab Act, it says that nothing in the Rehab Act should be interpreted to exclude a service from the school district of what they're supposed to be doing under IDEA. So if you want to think of it this way, kind of like the special ed system is the payer of first resort, and then the VR system is, the follow-up. But the VR system has to make sure they're spending at least 15% of their money. And the rehab money, the federal money, is 80%, 20 almost, federal to state. Whereas under IDEA, it's exactly the opposite. So the way in which the state will create its system of collaboration and coordination between the system, the special ed system and the VR system needs to recognize they have to spend at least 15% of their money on this VR, and they get more federal reimbursement. So you just have to look at the total picture. But concretely, I have a student that is going to be going to an after-school training situation, let's call it that. So they're going to go to a real job, they're going to be getting training on the job. They may need a supported employment of a job coach. Who's paying for the job coach? Who's going to get the student to that site? Who's going to provide other services off-site to help get the student ready for that on-the-job training experience? Summer job program. Under IDEA, the extended school year is really not an obligation of the special education system specifically. It doesn't say they couldn't do it, especially as a transition goal. But we know that one of the key issues for people with disabilities, anyone really, to get a job is if you already had a job. And we know that students with disabilities tend not to have the experiences of jobs while they're still in school. So really, this is a way to correct that shortfall, to give students with disabilities, while they're still in school, experiences in real job situations with the supports they need to be successful. And it can't just be, this is what we have. If you don't like it, lump it. It's got to be based on individual needs of students, so there needs to be a variety of experiences available for the students to choose from, or they don't even have to have it. I don't need it. I don't want it. Forget about it. This is another option, of course. But there is to be this individualization and this opportunity for real experiences in the real world with supports. And ideally, it should be a joint venture between VR and the special education system. Next slide. Really, the point here is this second bullet must identify the point of contact at each school so that the VR agency can connect with students who are being served under Section 504 and would not readily be identified through the IDEA. The IDEA, you have a IEP. Many school districts don't necessarily have a Section 504 plan. So there has to be some way for VR to know who is the Section 504 eligible students. So there has to be a point of contact at each school across the entire state. Not school district, each school. Okay, next slide. Now, this is an interesting question that came up that Josie asked me to address. Now, pre-employment transition services, if you remember, you don't have to apply for VR services. You don't have to be considered eligible for VR services. You just are a student with a disability, whether you're under IDEA or Section 504, you're entitled to get these services. However, you could also apply for actual services from the VR system. And when you apply for VR services, you have to go through the eligibility process. There's an IPE that's developed. And part of the process of getting services from the VR system is VR, unlike IDEA, is allowed to have what's called a waiting list. So if they don't have enough money to serve every person in their state, they are allowed to have what's called an order of selection. And it has to be top down. Students, people with the most significant disabilities go to the top of the list, of the waiting list. People with less significant disabilities are down the list. So this order of selection or waiting list is in effect in many states. So that if I'm applying for VR services, I'm found eligible, but I could be way down on the list for when I am going to get those services. So how does the order of selection process connect with pre-employment transition services? First of all, if you're only getting pre-employment transition services, you don't go through the eligibility process. So you don't have to worry about the order of selection. So when you're only getting pre-employment transition services, you don't have to worry about the order of selection because it's just not applicable. However, while you are receiving pre-employment transition services, like I said, you can also apply for additional transition services. That list of pre-employment transition services is very limited, and that's the only things you can get under pre-employment transition. If you needed something else from VR, you'd have to apply for VR services and be found eligible. So if you do apply for transition services from VR, and there is an order of selection in place, and you're low down on that list, you're not going to get those transition services until your name comes up on the waiting list. This is for individual transition services. There's another category called group transition services. They have a meeting with 20,000 people. You can come in. That's a group transition service as opposed to individual services for me. Really, the only reason why you'd want to apply for VR services is if you're looking specifically for individual transition services. So if you do apply for VR services, you have to wait to get those services until your name comes up on the waiting list. Next slide. So what happens if you are considering applying? If you're already receiving pre-employment services and then you apply for VR services and are put on the waiting list, you can continue to receive the pre-employment services that you've already been receiving, as well as any additional services. So the fact that you're on a waiting list for the transition services does not affect your ability to get the pre-employment transition services. However, if you had not already been receiving pre-employment transition services before you applied for the regular VR services and you're put on the waiting list, you're stuck. You don't get anything until your name comes up on that waiting list. So this is very important for all of you to know, and for all of you to be advising people out there, families that you're working with, that if you're considering applying for VR services and your state has an order of selection, get your foot in the door for the pre-employment transition services first, then apply for the regular additional services that you feel you need from the VR system. The alternative would be, depending what the service is go to your special education transition services and not even worry about VR until later in the game. It just depends on what the service you're looking for is. Is it something that the special ed system is also responsible for, or is it really something that you really can only get from the VR system? But then you just have to time it. So you start with your pre-employment transition services at 14, 15, or 16, then apply for your full VR services Get put on the waiting list for that possibly, but you can still get your pre-employment transition services. I hope this makes sense to everyone. It's a little confusing, but there is guidance from the Rehabilitation Services Administration, from RSA, to try and sort all this out. That's really all that I had as a formal presentation this afternoon. So I would like to encourage you all to ask your questions if you haven't already done so. And if you already have done so, then I want to turn it over, go to the next slide, and we can turn it over to, I think it's Jessica.
Unmuted.
Who have
Muted.
to track the questions, because I don't see any on my screen. So we can look to the question slide now and open up.
Unmuted.
Yes, there are questions, and okay, there are several questions here. Okay, and the first one is from Cindy Dodge, and she says, PA OVR just yesterday voted to close OOS despite parents, advocates, and the Rehab Council speaking out against it. My first thought when they announced this closure was, what would Ron Hager say? So an eligible person older than 21 years old with an IPE will not be on a waiting list. Is this true? PA OVR insist this closure is temporary. Have other states closed and then reopened OOS? How long are some waiting lists in other states? There are some fears and concerns in PA just because we do not know what to expect with this waiting list.
Right. So what typically happens in most states is that the order of selection is open for the people on the highest, with the highest disabilities, most severe disability. We have seen in a couple of states where they completely closed any new cases. So when a state implements an order of selection or closes a category, going opposite is opening, the people that are already getting services, again, forget pre-employment transition, this is just for regular VR services. The people that are already getting services are required, VR is required to continue to serve them even if they close the door for new applicants. We have heard of a couple of states that have completely closed their order of selection, and we double check with RSA. They are allowed to do this as long as they do all the proper process of doing it. And then as soon as they can, they should reopen. And so typically what we see is there is movement on the waiting list. So people don't just sit there forever. And we have seen the states go off of this closing of all the categories. And there's a couple of reasons why this is happening. One is obviously with pre-employment transition services, 15% of their budget is now taken away from them for doing regular services. So that adds a budget crunch. The second thing is there had been additional money under the stimulus funds that came out under the Obama administration. And so there were basically VR agencies were building that into their budget. Well, that money wasn't forever, it's gone. And so VR agencies didn't, from what I've been told, didn't really fully account for that. So that's why there's been more of a crunch in terms of providing services. But this is what they are allowed to do as long as they follow proper procedures. Definitely, this is something that I would suggest working with your client assistance program in your state on, coordinating with them and what they're doing to advocate systemic advocacy as well as individual advocacy.
Okay, there are a few more questions. There's one for Nicole Miller. Hi, Nicole from Michigan. I had to tell my VR agency to open up an authorization for my 14-year-old high schooler with a 504, which they did, but they still say they don't do anything until 11th and 12th grade. years. I even asked again 2 months ago. Any suggestions on battling this?
Yes. They're wrong. I mean, you could use the language in this webinar also that long VR, I call it a manual that I distributed that should have been sent out to everyone, gives all the chapter and verse, all the formal legal citations for all the stuff that's in this PowerPoint, as well as all the other things from soup to nuts. Everything about the VR system pretty much is in there. But the other thing is ultimately you may have to get an advocate. You know, if they're refusing to budge, you would want to call the client assistance program is a type of protection advocacy program specifically geared for the VR system. And there's one in every state. And like I said, in many states, most states, it's in the same agency. In Michigan, I think you said, I believe the client assistance program is the same agency as the protection advocacy program. And the other thing is to look at what it is you want from VR at 14. Is it something that would be pre-employment transition services? You don't even have to apply for VR services. Is it something that the school district could provide? But if it is something that's unique, that you really need VR to provide for you, go for it. Challenge it. Just like with special ed. You know how you have to fight the school district. They say no. Are they right? Are they wrong? You have to challenge it. Similar thing happens with VR. Where they say you can't do this, or we won't do this, or we can't do this. They're not always right. Sometimes they're wrong, and you have to then challenge it, just like with special ed.
Okay, we have another question from Cindy. Did federal dollars increase with the 15% PETS mandate, or do VRs have to use the same amount of dollars and now allocate 15% of those dollars to PETS?
They did not get any. Well, they may have gotten a little bit of more money, but it wasn't. They didn't get 15%. So that's the total budget, whatever it is for each individual year. They did not get 15% more money. They got whatever they normally get plus whatever cost of living was thrown in there. So that's part of the reason why we have this money crunch. Now, the reason why they did that, I think, was because if the VR agencies were following the law all along since 1992, I think Congress thought they probably should have been spending that much all along, and they never were. So they're basically forcing them to do what they were supposed to do since 1992. That's my read on it. But that's not anything that's official. That's just my sense of it.
Okay, there are more questions here, Ron. How can I find or get a copy of the manual mentioned? Is it on the RAISE or CPER website?
I don't know where it is. I'm sure it's on the RAISE website. I don't know if Josie wants to weigh in here, Josie. What I call the VR manual. I know you guys have a different name for it. Where people could find it.
This is Josie. So I guess it's a split answer. Number one, Ron, is it on one of your sites, the VR toolkit?
It is, but it is on my site, but it's not something they can access.
Okay. So we will make sure that
I can email it to you, and then you can. I'll re-email it to you.
Okay. So we will repost that as a
resource. I'll re-email it.
But as a side note, we are working on creating a family parent center friendly version of it, and so that will be coming out later with Ron's help and the Constantines, and there are some other support people that are working to make it parent center friendly, so that will be coming out later this summer as well.
Right. Yeah, the problem with that document is it was primarily written with a legal audience in mind. And so by being comprehensive, it's also impenetrable for the normal person. But it is, if you're comfortable with wading through stuff and really want chapter and verse, it's all in there. So that what they're doing is translating it down into the real world. So I appreciate the effort that Ray's is doing to make that happen. But for those of you that want the real nitty gritty, it can be helpful. I did it for the client assistance program primarily. That was the primary audience. And not all of them are lawyers. A lot of the client assistance program people are advocates. Okay, and more questions?
Yes, there are a couple of questions from Mara Laviola, and the question is, if our school district did not invite our VR rep to our IP meeting, but our VR rep is aware of my child and their needs, is there then an affirmative duty to come if they are on notice, just like the school has an affirmative obligation to invite the VR to the IP meeting?
You know, the issue is the IEP needs to really reflect the student's needs, and the goal is to have the VR perspective at the table when they're developing the special ed IEP. So it can happen in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to happen with a face-to-face in-person meeting, but as long as, that's the optimal. But as long as the school district has the input from the VR counselor's perspective about that student and what that student might need for the IEP as part of the transition plan, that's the goal. That's the goal. And then for pre-employment transition services, the specific services to the student, that's a different question. But obviously VR would still need to be involved in that. Even if they're not directly providing the services, they have to be coordinating. As I said, coordinating with the school district on the provision of those services.
Okay, there's another question from Maria, and it is, where can we find a comprehensive list of VR services so we can compare them to the pre-employment transition services?
Well, again, this manual, one of the sections includes all of the required VR services that are mandated services. And then there's a whole separate section on pre-employment transition and what's spelled out in this PowerPoint. You hear many times VR people say that the VR system is not an entitlement, and it's partially true. And the reason it's not an entitlement is because they can have a waiting list, but they're supposed to every person that they find eligible and develop an IPE for, they're supposed to provide every service that person needs to meet their employment goal. They cannot say, well, we don't have enough money to give you your full tuition to go to college, even though that's your goal. The goal is not to go to college. The goal is to go to college and then be prepared to do this or that job. So what they're supposed to do is, yeah, they can use other funding sources that you might have to supplement what they provide, but they have to make sure that, if you're going to college, that you have the support you need to get there and to go through it, or whatever it is you need. I want to be a welder. You have to, everything that you need to be a welder, they need to provide. So what happens is VR tends to say, we're going to just give everyone a little bit of stuff, and no one gets everything that they need because we want to try and save money. That's illegal. What they're supposed to do is go to the order of selection, which is painful if you don't have if your disability is not as significant as others. But in terms of what the law requires, that's what they're supposed to do. So the list, all the stuff that I've talked about today, is in this long 75-page document with 3,000 footnotes. It's not that bad, but it's pretty bad. It's pretty long. A lot of footnotes.
Okay, there are a couple of questions from Phil Hayes. And is there a list of states that are in compliance with the 15%?
No, not that I know of. I don't know if that would be something you'd have to go and look on the RSA page. I don't think they're keeping track of that. I mean, they do their individual monitoring of the states, and if they come up with a monitoring report, It's going to be based on that state. So I don't think they're just monitoring like they've always monitored the VR system, similar to what OSEP, Office of Special Education Programs, does for the special ed programs. That would be the only way that we would know what a state is doing, unless you asked at the state rehab council, the state rehabilitation council asked the VR agency to let them know how they're spending their VR dollars, and specifically how they're spending their pre-employment transition dollars. That would be another way to know in your state, but I don't think there's any I don't know of any exchange from one state to another, or a list of all the different states, what they're doing, and anything related to VR.
Okay. I don't see any more questions.
Next.
Okay. Next slide. Yep.
Going once, going twice.
Okay, well, everyone, Ron, thank you so much for spending some time with us. This topic is incredibly complex, and as we've been working with the tool that Ron created, who has pulled together so many resources and research and court cases, it was still so complicated to talk about the information that was right in front of us. And so if you have further questions, we will make sure that Ron's guide is on our page at reconsider.org. And as I mentioned earlier, there will be a family parent center, more so friendly version of this information from Ron in probably an information brief format that will be made available sometime between July and September. We will have another webinar to introduce that tool, and we hope to be able to share that with a lot of you, because we know how complicated this information is, and we know how important and how it can be such a support to so many of us. So thank you all for joining us. Is there another slide, Miriam?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so our next webinar is Wednesday, July 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And it's on post-secondary preparation for families and professionals. It will be presented by IEL and some of their newly updated and created materials. I hope you are able to join us, and I hope you're able to complete the survey evaluation that you will be receiving immediately. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
And thank you all. It's a pleasure to be meeting with you this afternoon. Take care, everyone.